Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Welcome to our virtual tour of Viva la Libertad, Latin America and the Age of Revolutions. I'm Will Hansen. I'm Director of Reader Services and Curator of Americana here at the Newberry Library and the curator of this exhibition. So I'm delighted to welcome you to it virtually and hope that you can visit in person eventually. The exhibition opened on April 2nd and will be up through July 24th. So Viva la Libertad reflects on the struggles for independence that spread across Latin America in the early decades of the 19th century. I'm gonna flip my screen here so I can start showing you parts of the exhibition. You probably won't be able to see this very much, but what I'm showing you here is a timeline of the struggles for independence in Latin America, pointing out some of the key moments in it from around the 1780s to into the 1830s. And that's the main time frame that the exhibit focuses on. But one of the things that we try to show in the exhibition is that in many ways, the struggles for liberation, freedom, have not ended in the years since independence was won in Latin America. One of the ways that we do this right at the start of the exhibition is by looking at these prints from 2018, so just a couple of years ago, that were produced by a collective of printmakers from Mexico and the United States, thinking about ideas related to territory, citizenship, and autonomy, sovereignty, which were central themes in the struggles in Latin America during the Age of Revolutions, and that continue to be debated, contested, and reimagined. So we're thinking about how this connects to the present day, as well as how these issues played out in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. At the same time, the roots of these struggles extend much farther back into the past than the 1780s. So the oldest book in the exhibition is this book from 1543 of the New Laws of the Indies, which was published in Spain in 1543. And was published really to respond to criticism about the treatment of indigenous peoples in the Spanish Empire in the Americas, in South America in particular, but also Mexico and Central America. And tension was percolating through the 16th century, 17th century, and 18th century related to colonizers and their relationships to indigenous peoples, relationships to enslaved peoples, and their treatment of them. And this continued into the 19th century until people of the Americas, colonists in the Americas, finally achieved freedom from colonial rule. So one of the other issues that was central to the independence struggles in Latin America was, just like in what became the United States in the American Revolution, taxation was a big issue, and feeling like taxes were too high and were distributed without representation by the colonized people themselves. So here we're looking at a map that maybe doesn't have an obvious connection to taxation, but what it was doing was trying to give Spanish administrators a better sense of the land that they were responsible for to the Spanish Empire, understanding it better so that they could better collect the taxes and take them back to Spain. All of these things that were hugely resented by the colonists themselves. So resistance among many colonists focused on taxation, other kinds of abuses of power by European-born, not American-born colonial officials, and also arguing against some of the racial hierarchies imposed by the Spanish and Portuguese administrators. What you're seeing here is a table that shows the various racial mixtures of white people, Black people, and indigenous people, and the sort of rights and privileges that went along with those levels of caste, along with a suite of prints that shows these racial mixtures and the castes as they were administered in the empires. Of course, others were also arguing against slavery in this time period, and the history of enslavement of African people and indigenous people is a large part of this story as well. We have a print here showing a diagram of a slave ship that brought people across the Atlantic. This is actually a British example, but also representative of the kinds of slave ships that were used in the Spanish and Portuguese empires as well. it's a powerful artifact, and we sort of set it up in this room to give a place for sort of reflection and meditation for those thinking about this history. In some cases, resistance was also led by indigenous people themselves. And one of my favorite things in the exhibition is this item, which is known as the Codex Zimpalala. This is a document created by the Nahua people in the village of Zimpalala in central Mexico in the first half of the 18th century. And they used this book, this handmade book on native Amate paper to document their attachment to these lands going back hundreds of years in arguing for the Spanish administrators about their rights to these lands and their longstanding rights to the lands. So it's a wonderful book that includes examples of the Nahuatl language, the language of the Aztec Empire and the peoples that were in the Aztec Empire. So a wonderful thing there. We're also including some graphics in the exhibition that highlight people who might be lesser known, but were nevertheless very important in the story of Latin American independence. This is a woman named Michaela Bastas, who was central in the indigenous rebellion of 1780 to 1782 in the Andes, in Peru and thereabouts. She was married to the better known person in this rebellion, Tupac Amaru II. She was his wife and was integral to this effort, which was the largest indigenous rebellion in the Americas through the 18th century. And this rebellion was an important precursor to what would eventually become independence in Latin America. So we highlight 4 of these individuals through the exhibition as well. So moving on, this is the first room of the exhibition, and we're going to move into the larger second room now. If you're just joining us, my name is Will Hansen. I'm curator of the exhibition Viva la Libertad, which is what we're looking at right now. It is on display at the Newberry now through July 24th. So moving into the second section of the exhibition, which focuses on the revolutions that fed into and in many ways inspired Latin American independence. The independence movements in Latin America, of course, did not occur in a vacuum. They had connections to and drew inspiration from the American Revolution, what we call the American Revolution, the revolution that led to the creation of the United States. And a wonderful print that's in the exhibition is what I'm showing you here. This is showing the destruction of the statue of King George III in New York City in 1776, on July 9th in particular, right after the Declaration of Independence was first read in New York. We actually just acquired this pretty recently at the library. It's a spectacular print. It is not exactly accurate because the printmaker in Europe did not know that this was actually a statue of King George III on a horse, so he didn't depict that. And he also depicts enslaved people pulling down the statue, which may or may not have been the case. It may have been a mixture of white colonists and enslaved African Americans. But nonetheless, it's a powerful artifact showing, again, connections to the present day, monuments and statues being an issue that has come up in recent years and was coming up then as well. The pulling down of King George III's statue was a historical event that really showed the passion of the American colonists in seeking their independence from the British colonies. It wasn't just the US Revolution, though, that was part of this story. The Haitian Revolution was also central to Latin American interest in independence. We have a case of material related to the Haitian Revolution here, including this print showing the great hero of the Haitian Revolution, Toussaint Louverture. The Haitian Revolution, of course, led to the second independent state in the Americas, in the Western Hemisphere, and the world's first Black republic eventually. And it was news about the Haitian Revolution and rhetoric from the Haitian Revolution was attempted to be kept out of the Spanish and Portuguese empires by administrators. They were quite fearful that this would foment insurrections and rebellions of enslaved people in their colonies as well. The French Revolution, of course, was very important in this story as well. And the rhetoric of the French Revolution was was a key inspiration for those struggling for independence in Latin America. You can see a beautifully calligraphed printing of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, with one of the key documents from the French Revolution, which inspired independence struggles all around the world. But moving on, when asked about Latin American independence, most people will mention first people like Simón Bolívar. And Bolívar is in this exhibition. You can see a illustration depicting him from a book that was actually produced in the United States in 1826, showing what a celebrated figure he was there. Some other people might know one of the other famous liberators of South America, Jose de San Martin, the liberator of Argentina in particular, among other countries. And this is a map that shows his famous crossing of the Andes Mountains, one of the great feats of the military struggle for independence. But of course, millions of people were involved in these fights for liberty, from Mexico all the way down to the southern tip of South America and Chile. And we've tried to highlight people who are perhaps lesser known and deserve wider recognition as part of this story as well. They include, feminist thinkers. Women are a part of this story as well. A very small book that I can't show you particularly well is in the exhibition here. It is an almanac produced in Mexico shortly after Mexico had won its independence, which has the title translated to Calendar for the Year 1825, dedicated to the American ladies, especially the patriots. And it includes biographies of some of the women who were integral to winning independence, like Leona Vicario and others in Mexico, who were fundamental to winning independence from Spain in Mexico. It also includes people like priests and Catholic parishioners. The Catholic Church was such an influential institution in Latin America at this time period. And you can see here a print of Father Miguel Hidalgo, the father of Mexican independence, who started the Mexican War for Independence in 1808. There's also a sermon where church fathers are denouncing Hidalgo and arguing against supporting Mexican independence. So there were views on both sides of this issue among priests and parishioners. There were also, particularly among the military troops, people like cowboys and herdsmen. In this case, another great image of the llaneros, who were plainsmen who were renowned for their skill as horsemen. And you can see a plate here where showing them with their lances attacking a Spanish troop. They were fabled for this maneuver where they would slide down to the side of their horses and then pop up to attack with their lances. So some wonderful material about the gauchos and the llaneros who were integral to these efforts. And printers and readers were also part of this story as well. Another one of my favorites in the exhibition is this little book. Again, I can't get terribly close to it, but I can, hopefully you can see that there's an engraved print here, which accompanied the printing of the Mexican Constitution of 1824, the Republican Constitution of Mexico from that year. The engraving shows a Phrygian cap, which was a sort of ancient symbol of liberty, over the Mexican emblem of the eagle holding a serpent in its mouth on top of a cactus. And then below it, there's a cactus that has various paddles labeled with the various Mexican states, just like the stars on an American flag. You can see the paddles of the cactus form the Mexican state in this print. So printing and printmakers were also part of this story. Moving from the very small to the very large, another one of my favorites in the exhibition are these two maps, which you can sort of start to see here, and I'll start to move closer to them. Maps were integral to the colonial enterprise in the Americas, and then to independence as well. And we're showing in this exhibit 3 of the major maps of the time period, in particular 2 that are very important. Let me readjust here to try to get this centered. This map is often cited as one of the most important maps in the history of what would become the United States. This is John Mitchell's map of the British and French dominions of North America from 1755, which came out of a time when the British, the French, and the Spanish were all fighting over the borders of their territory in North America. Incredibly important for colonizers using the maps to administer their colonies. Later, liberators of nations would use the maps to create the boundaries of the new countries emerging from colonial rule. And a good example of that is the largest map in the exhibition, which I'm going to have to back up to give you the full scope of. This is the map of South America created by a map maker named Cruz Cano, Juan de Cruz Cano, in 1775. So right as the American Revolution is ramping up, this map was created for the Spanish crown and Spanish administrators, and was really kept a state secret into the 19th century. It was not published, not made widely available, because Spain felt like it included state secrets about its South American territory and the borders between Spanish and Portuguese territories. It's a very spectacular thing, and it functions as much as a sort of emblem of power and empire, as including important cartographic information. Both of those things are present here. Walk in a little bit so you can see some of the detail on it. It's quite spectacular, both in the large scale and in the small scale. Lots of details here. It is very easily both one of the most accurate and one of the most beautiful maps of South America produced in the 18th century, and used in settling border disputes between colonies as well as between the newly independent states in Latin America into the 19th century. Stop here to mention, once again, for newcomers, my name is Will Hansen. I'm curator of the exhibition Viva la Libertad, Latin America and the Age of Revolutions, which is what we're walking through right now, on display at the Newberry Library through July 24th. The third map actually comes from the period when independence has won, but is very important for thinking about how borders get created and how they get administered into the 20th century. This is a map from the Mexican-American War. So shortly after Mexico had won its independence, the United States started putting its eyes south towards this territory. Texas was annexed, originally became its own republic, and then was annexed by the US in the 1830s. And then the Mexican-American War sprang up in the 1840s. This is the map from 1847, often known as the Disternell map. This is the map that was used in the negotiations around the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which was the treaty that ended the Mexican-American War and ceded much of what is now the American Southwest to the United States. So you can see on this map that the map of the United States of Mexico, as they're fashioned here, includes what is now present-day California, a lot of, pretty much all of Arizona and New Mexico, parts of most of the rest of the southwestern states as well. But this map was famous because it was used at the treaty negotiations, famously not a wholly accurate map, and problems with the border as it related to the Rio Grande, in particular, the route of the Rio Grande, cropped up into the 20th century and continued into the 20th century. Question came up about whether there was any way to know percentages of various Latin American populations that would have actively supported these independence struggles. That's a good question that I don't know the answer to off the top of my head. I can tell you that I'm sure that there are varying estimates on that. And there were some who supported these revolutions, and there were a fair number of loyalists as well. Most of these independence struggles started as civil wars, essentially, because there were people on both sides, fighting on both sides. It was by no means unanimous in any area. And there were some areas, particularly in South America, that were that were famous holdouts. Peru famously was an area where the independence movement was not as strong as in other areas like, say, Venezuela or Argentina. So it was a struggle, and there were varying percentages or proportions of loyalists and rebels across South America. But I can't give you a number off the top of my head, I'm afraid. Sorry. Okay, so moving into sort of later material, we've been talking a little bit about border disputes and territorial negotiations through this period, and those occurred both before and after independence. The new nations from Mexico down into South America also had to fend off U.S. and British attempts to dominate the Western Hemisphere, to treat them as sort of subservient states. And this print is showing a U.S. Speaker of the House, also a senator, statesman named Henry Clay, who fashioned himself in this print as the advocate for South American independence. Henry Clay is holding here in this print his resolution introduced into the House of Representatives and eventually passed, in which it was finally stated that the United States did in fact support these independence movements, supported Latin American independence from Spain. This would lead to, in 1823, the Monroe Doctrine, the famous doctrine in which the US basically told European states, hands off from the entire Western Hemisphere, we'll take care of it. Sorry, just getting to another question here about types of sources we might try to look at and gauge different popular opinions from the time. We do have a lot of interesting sources for that could be looked at. Spain did include, did lots of tracking of sort of their colonies, as well as Portugal did. And there might be sources in the archives that have been published or that have been transcribed and held here at the Newberry that get into sort of a sense, if not a statistical sense, at least a sense from the Spanish administrator's perspective of how much support they had versus how much support the rebels had. So there are some potential sources there, and you're welcome to get in touch with us through our reference channels to ask about those. So these new countries also had to tackle complicated questions about citizenship, participatory government. But one of the last points I'll make is that throughout the former colonies of the Americas, in Latin America as well as in North America and the United States, these struggles for governments that support true civil and human rights continue to this day. In the last case of the exhibition here, there is a nice sort of graphic that summarizes the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights from shortly after World War II. There's also a book here about the revised Bolivian Constitution of 2009, which granted more rights to indigenous peoples in Bolivia, granted the Huifala, the sort of indigenous Andean flag, the status of a second primary flag of the state of Bolivia, and lots of other indigenous rights related to environmental justice and other things. Lots of other great material in here too, but I will have to skip over it for now. So that's a brief tour of Viva la Libertad, Latin America and the Age of Revolutions. The exhibition will be up through July 24th here at the Newberry. You're welcome to come in and take a look at it. There will also be some programs coming in April, May, June, and thereafter related to this subject. So if there aren't any other questions, I will just say thank you for tuning in.